Well, I got some good reaction from my previous woodworking video, so I thought I might make another one. And for those of you that don't have grandkids, thought you might be interested to see some of the motivation for what we do. This was a previous project, at least part of it. Pardon the shaking. It looks like that one has come loose on one end, so I need to go rehang that one a little bit. But that's a little painted birdhouse that we made a few weeks ago. And there are a few more over here that you see in the trees and so on. And then down here is a project that's dear to our heart. Our littlest grandchild loves Thomas, so we made him one. So anyway, that's where I'm going now. I'm going to maybe show you a little bit of the finish up of those boxes I made a few weeks ago, and then move on and start a new project in the workshop. Here we have the 3 recipients beginning the decoration on the boxes. Now you see my motivation for some of this, and so let me tell you what it is that I'm thinking of doing here. The first thing is I have a lot of plywood like this laying around. This is well, it's advertised as 1/4 inch, but it's really not. It's less than 1/4 inch thick, and you have to be careful of that. And I had some 3/8 inch boards left. What I did is I glued them up. I don't know if you can see the glue line there, but I did that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a groove in the middle of this, and just big enough to hold a piece of plywood, like that. And the ultimate result is I'm going to make some little painting frames that after that birdhouse project, one thing that I discovered that was very popular was the grandkids wanted to paint up a lot of the scrap that I had left over. So I thought, well, maybe I'll make them a little prettier, make them into a real frame, and let them do some painting on that. My wife is an artist and teaches art, and so I think she'll be able to give them some creative things to do, and they'll have a lot of fun. Now, to cut this groove, I've had to remove the saw guard again, the blade guard. And so, at the risk of boring all of you, I'm going to have to give you my safety lecture again. Do not work with power tools, or actually with any tools, unless you understand how to use them safely. And that doesn't mean watching a video on YouTube. That means actually having some instruction from someone, either a teacher in school, if you took some vocational training, or someone who is already an accomplished woodworker and understands safety, who can be your mentor or something of that sort. I do not recommend anyone trying to make something from a YouTube video. Second, removing the guard is something you really have to understand the risks you're taking. The guard is there for a very good reason, and even with the guard you can get hurt. When you remove the guard, you raise the risk probably double or triple. So you really have to know what you're doing. Unfortunately, there are a few projects like this one where there's no way I can cut a groove along the length of this board with the saw without removing the guard. So that's why I'm doing it. Do not do this yourself unless you understand what you're doing and are willing to accept all the risk. Okay, enough for the lesson for today. I've raised the blade to slightly above the table and set it about the right distance from the fence so that the blade will cut just a little bit to the right of center. So let me show you one of those cuts, or actually let me do one of those cuts and show you what it looks like. one of the first things that I want to show you, I've cut the groove and I'll show you how I did it in a minute, but you'll notice that the groove that I've cut exactly fits this plywood. Now this is a nicer grade of plywood and it's billed as 1/4 inch. And it's almost a 1/4 inch thick. And you see how that fits. Now, watch what happens, however, when you use this cheaper plywood you can find. Now, that plywood I bought at a good lumber yard. It's called Fine Lumber and Plywood, and they carry the really good stuff. I have not ever been able to find this quality plywood at a big box store. What you find there instead is something like this. Now that also is billed as 1/4 inch, or at least commonly called that in the industry. But if you will notice, there is a significant gap. Let me show you how big a gap there is. Well, I've got to get it to focus to see it, but you see how when I push it to one side, how there's a gap on this side, and yet it fits that plywood perfectly. So be sure that first you know what kind of plywood you're going to be using if you try to cut these grooves. Second thing is, how do you do that on a table saw? Well, what you do is you set the blade to about the right height for what you want, in other words the depth of the groove, and then you set the distance from the fence to the blade to be about half. That is about half the width of the board. So the blade cuts almost right down the middle. Then you make 2 passes, and let me show you how you do that. The first pass, I'm going to do it with the power off, you do like this. At the end of that pass, you turn the lumber end for end, putting the other face against the fence, and you run that side through. Now once again, this is just to get you started. Then you bump the fence over. That is, you loosen the fence up and you bump it over a fraction of an inch. And you do that again, both sides. Each time you check with the plywood. When you start getting close, then I recommend you only do one side at a time. In other words, when you bump it, just cut one side. Because remember, everything you bump on the table saw is going to be doubled in the groove. So if you bump the fence over by, say, a 1/64 of an inch, that means the groove is going to get a 1/32 of an inch, or 2/64 wider, because remember, you're cutting on both sides. Okay, well, let me try and get some more done on this and see if I can get some frames made up with this plywood. I've now cut the grooves in one side of each of these boards, and I thought I might show you what a fairly good fit is. If you notice, when you pick up the plywood, the joint goes with it. Now, you don't want something that you have to hammer or jam into the groove, but you do want something that provides what's called a friction fit. In other words, the natural imperfections in the plywood will produce something that wavers a little bit. In other words, it presses on one side in one spot and on the other side in another. But you want a groove that when the plywood is straightened out and inserted in the groove, it fits. And if it's a friction fit, you can pick up the plywood and the grooved board comes with it. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to cut a groove in the other side of this board, each of the two. The purpose is we're going to actually try to make 2 frames out of each out of each board. So in other words, I've cut the groove in the end here. I'm now going to cut a groove over here. Then I'm going to rip this right down the middle, producing two pieces. So let me do that, and then I'll come back and show you the result. I've now cut grooves on both sides of these two pieces of wood. See on the other side there, and they almost exactly fit the plywood that I'm using. So now I can change the setup on the saw. And one thing that I will suggest, in addition to the safety rules that come with your saw and anything and everything you learned from a mentor or a shop teacher, I always unplug the saw whenever I'm making a setup change, even if I'm not going to actually be touching the blade. And once again, that's just something that I kind of add to the safety rules. You should always, at least I think you should always unplug a power tool or remove the battery if it's a battery operated tool. So there's no possible way it can come on accidentally while you're working on it to change the setup. So now I'm going to install the guard on this blade, which I always try to do as soon as I've finished using the blade in this open position. And then we'll show you the next set of cuts. I set the saw blade to cut exactly in half, and then I ripped the board down the middle, and you see it produces a pair of sides. These are going to make the frames. In other words, we'll miter these into a frame and put the plywood in the center for painting. Okay, let me cut this other one, and then we'll be ready to cut the miters. I've now cut all 4 boards, or cut the 2 boards in half. So now let's take them over to the miter saw, which is over here, and set up to make the miters to create a picture frame. And there you see the miter cut to the inside. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut exactly the same 45 degree on this other board in exactly the same way, that is with this to the groove to the inside. And that'll allow me to measure and see if I get exactly 90 degrees when I put these two together. Now I cut the other one here. However, unlike the first cut where the cutoff remained on the tabletop, on this one it wound up lying way over there. That's the reason why that I always like to keep the blade between myself and any little cutoffs, because they will catch sometimes in the blade and be thrown. And when they are, you want something solid like the blade to stop it. You don't want to depend just on your safety glasses. So, okay, now let's try these and see if they measure 90 degrees. And here you see I've put the miters together and then used a framing square to check that I did a true 90 degree angle out of the 245s. That tells me that I am cutting a 45 degree angle, not a 44 or a 46. So now it's time to cut the rest of these, and I'll figure out how long I want them and so on. And by the way, you notice I cut the frame first, then the plywood to fit the frame rather than the other way around, because getting the corners right on the frame is more important than the actual dimensions, since there's no particular specification on this. This is just a whatever you have kind of project. So let me go ahead and do all that, and then we'll be ready to glue things up. I'm now cutting the miters on the sides to make the frames, and I've got a number of them that I've cut over there already. But I should mention something, because if you want to get each side and each end to be exactly the same length, you really need to use something like a stop block, like I'm using here, where I have this board clamped so that this comes exactly to the end of the bed here on the miter saw. Now that just happens that the bed on this miter saw came out exactly right for the length I wanted. It might not always be at the end here. It could be back here, and in fact, when I cut the shorter sides, this piece of wood, the stop block, was actually down here somewhere. So at any rate, you cut one end like that, and then, and that doesn't really matter there, you're just basically cutting it off so that you get a nice sharp edge here at the end of the wood. Then you turn it over and put it against the stop block like that to cut the next one. So I'm going to finish cutting these out, and then I'll show you the results. And I hope you won't mind I left the air conditioner on. But basically, there are the sides and ends all cut, and you'll notice I have them lined up against the fence of the radial arm saw there. If I were making fine furniture joints, I would run these on a shooting board. In other words, I'm not going to show you that. If you're interested in that kind of thing, several people, Paul Sellers, for example, and many woodworkers on YouTube will show you how to build a shooting board and how to use it with a plane and everything. I'm not going to go to that much trouble on this one, because after all, these are not intended to be fine furniture. They're just using up some old scrap lumber. But I do want the joints to fit well, so that's why I've been fairly meticulous in making sure that at least the saw cuts are done pretty accurately. And as you can see, when you look down the line there, they're all exactly the same length. And now I've cut some panels. They look like this. They're basically 5 by 7. In other words, I've sized this so that the interior of this is a 5 by 7, which is a kind of standard size. I made sure I checked with my wife, who is an artist, to make sure that I was using a standard size. And of course that means the panels need to be slightly bigger than that because they need to go in the grooves. But at any rate, this is the first one, dry fitted. It's not yet glued up. So now what we have to do is cut the rest of the panels and glue up all 4 of these. You may remember that the rest of them are all over there under that piece of plywood. So that's the next task, and once they're glued up and primed, they'll be ready for the grandkids when they get back. I believe they are out in West Texas, actually, visiting their other grandparents, and I know they're having a blast. They always do. So anyway, when they get back, we'll hope to have these frames ready for them to paint next time they're over.